I thought raising a grateful son meant sacrificing everything for his dreams. At midnight, I discovered he'd stolen $43,000 from my retirement account. By 7 a.m., I'd made sure he'd never see a penny of his trust fund again. That's the truth. Raw, brutal, and life-changing. My name is Diana Stone, and this is the story of how my own son destroyed 15 years of my financial security in a single night, and how I destroyed his future in a single morning. Because sometimes, the most loving thing a mother can do is let her child face the consequences of their choices, no matter how much it breaks her heart. At 52 years old, I thought I had this single motherhood thing figured out. I'd worked double shifts as a nurse practitioner for 15 years, sacrificing sleep, social life, and my own comfort to build a secure future for my son, Dante. Every extra hour at City General Hospital, every missed dinner, every Christmas shift I worked while other mothers were home opening presents with their kids, all of it was for him. But the person I thought I was raising, grateful, honest, hard-working, turned out to be a stranger living in my house, eating my food, and planning to steal my life savings. Let me paint you the picture of that night, because the details matter. It was 11:47 p.m. when I finally dragged myself through my front door after another brutal shift in the emergency ward. My feet were screaming in my white nursing shoes. My scrubs were stained with coffee and God knows what else, and all I wanted was to check my retirement account balance, a monthly ritual that usually brought me comfort, and fall into bed. I had no idea that while I was saving lives at the hospital, my son was at home destroying mine. The number that appeared on my laptop screen didn't make sense at first. $127. I blinked hard, convinced I was hallucinating from exhaustion. I refreshed the page once, twice, 3 times. The number didn't change. My retirement account, the one that had shown $43,000 just last week, was nearly empty. My hands started shaking as I clicked through the transaction history. There it was, time-stamped at 12:23 a.m. that very night, a transfer of $42,973 to an account I didn't recognize. While I was inserting IVs and comforting grieving families, my 23-year-old son had cleaned out my retirement fund, like I was some stranger whose credit card he'd found on the street. But this wasn't a random theft. This was personal. This was my own child. The baby I'd rocked to sleep through countless nights. The little boy who used to beg me to read just one more story. The teenager who'd promised he understood why Mommy had to work so much. This was Dante, my Dante, reducing 15 years of my sacrifice to a gambling chip in his cryptocurrency fantasy. The betrayal hit me like a physical force. I actually doubled over in my desk chair, my chest tight with a pain that had nothing to do with exhaustion and everything to do with the shattering realization that the person I'd trusted most in the world had just stolen my future while I was out earning the money he'd taken. You know what the worst part was? The security footage from my laptop showed him at my desk at exactly 12:23 a.m., casually typing in passwords I'd saved for household bill management. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't hesitant. He moved with the confidence of someone who believed he had every right to take what wasn't his. That's when I realized I hadn't raised a grateful son. I'd raised an entitled thief who saw my life's work as his inheritance to claim whenever he felt like it. But here's what Dante didn't know about his mother. Diana Stone doesn't just roll over and accept betrayal. Diana Stone doesn't enable thieves, even when those thieves share her DNA. And Diana Stone definitely doesn't let anyone, not even her own child, steal her future without consequences. So while he slept peacefully in the bedroom I'd painted for him when he was 7, while he dreamed whatever dreams entitled young men dream after stealing from their mothers, I was awake planning his financial apocalypse, because if he could destroy my security in the darkness of midnight, I could destroy his assumptions about unconditional support in the bright light of morning, and that's exactly what I did. By 7 a.m., I had transferred his entire $180,000 trust fund to a scholarship program for children of single mothers. Every penny I'd saved for his future, gone. Every investment I'd made in his name, redirected. The safety net I'd spent 15 years weaving for him, cut to shreds with the same cold efficiency he'd used to steal from me. This is the story of what happens when unconditional love meets conditional gratitude. This is the story of a mother who learned that protecting her child from consequences isn't love, it's enabling. And this is the story of how sometimes the most expensive lessons are the ones that finally teach us what really matters. My name is Diana Stone, and this is how I lost my retirement fund but found my backbone. This is how my son lost his trust fund but hopefully found his character. And this is how a family torn apart by betrayal might just find a way to rebuild on something stronger than money: respect. To understand how we got to that devastating moment at midnight, you need to know the story of Diana Stone, a woman who rebuilt her entire life from nothing, not once, but twice. 15 years ago, I was a completely different person. I was married to Richard Stone, living in a comfortable suburban home with our 8-year-old son Dante, working part-time as a registered nurse, while my husband managed his struggling construction business. I thought I had it all figured out. I thought our family was solid, our future was secure, and my biggest worry was whether Dante would make the travel soccer team. Then Richard left, not gradually, not after months of fighting or counseling, or any of the dramatic confrontations you see in movies. He just left. One Tuesday morning, I woke up to find a note on the kitchen counter next to Dante's lunchbox. I can't do this anymore. The business is failing and I need to start over somewhere else. You and Dante are better off without me. Just like that, I went from being part of a family to being a single mother with a mortgage I couldn't afford, medical bills from Dante's broken arm the month before, and approximately $1,100 in our checking account. Richard had cleaned out our savings to pay his business debts without telling me, leaving us with nothing but his apologies and empty promises to send money when he got back on his feet. That money never came, not once in 15 years. I remember sitting at my kitchen table that first night, surrounded by bills I couldn't pay, looking at my sleeping son and making a promise that would define the next decade and a half of my life. Dante would never feel insecure again. Whatever it took, however hard I had to work, my son would have everything he needed to succeed. The transformation wasn't easy. I picked up extra shifts at the hospital, working days, nights, weekends, whatever they'd give me. But I quickly realized that my RN salary, even with overtime, wasn't enough to provide the life I wanted for Dante. So I made a decision that nearly broke me. I enrolled in a nurse practitioner program while working full-time. Picture this. I'd work a 12-hour shift at the hospital, drive straight to evening classes, study until 2 a.m., grab 3 hours of sleep, then get up to make Dante breakfast and help with his homework before starting the cycle all over again. My sister Carla used to babysit him during my evening classes, shaking her head and telling me I was going to burn out. "Diana, you're pushing yourself too hard," she'd say. "Dante doesn't need you to be Superwoman." But she was wrong. Dante did need me to be Superwoman, because I was all he had. His father had abandoned us. His paternal grandparents had sided with Richard and cut off contact, and my own parents lived across the country on their fixed retirement income. It was just me and Dante against the world, and I was determined to win. The sacrifice was brutal. I missed school plays because I was working. I sent store-bought cupcakes to class parties instead of homemade ones because I didn't have time to bake. I fell asleep during parent-teacher conferences and had to apologize to his teachers for being exhausted. But every sacrifice felt worth it when I saw Dante's grades, when I heard him tell his friends about the college fund I was building for him, when he hugged me and said, "Thanks for working so hard, Mom." By the time I graduated with my nurse practitioner degree, Dante was 16, and I was completely burned out but triumphant. My salary nearly doubled, which meant I could finally breathe a little easier. I could afford his car insurance when he got his license. I could pay for SAT prep courses. I could start thinking about college tuition without breaking into a cold sweat. But more importantly, I felt like I'd proven something to both of us. Diana Stone doesn't quit. Diana Stone fights for her family. Diana Stone makes things happen through sheer force of will and an ungodly amount of caffeine. Our relationship during his high school years was everything I'd hoped for. Dante was a good student, not valedictorian material, but solid B's and A's. He played varsity tennis, had a nice group of friends, and seemed genuinely appreciative of everything I provided. When he crashed my car during his senior year, a stupid mistake involving black ice and teenage overconfidence, I didn't even hesitate to use our emergency fund to replace it. Accidents happen, I told him, watching the relief flood his face. That's what insurance and emergency funds are for. When he struggled with organic chemistry during his freshman year of college and was in danger of losing his pre-med track, I hired a private tutor for $75 an hour. When he decided to switch to business instead, I supported that decision even though it meant the expensive science courses had been a waste. Your happiness matters more than my money, I told him, and I meant it. Every dollar I spent on his success felt like an investment in our shared future. Looking back now, I can see the pattern I was creating, but at the time, it felt like love. It felt like being the mother I'd wished I'd had, supportive, understanding, always ready to cushion his falls. I never wanted Dante to feel the fear I'd felt that night when Richard left. The terror of being abandoned and having to figure everything out alone. So I became his safety net for everything. Bad grades? I hired tutors. Financial mistakes? I covered them. Social drama? I listened and offered advice. Dante never had to face a consequence that I couldn't soften, or a problem that I couldn't solve with money or time or pure maternal determination. And it worked. Or at least I thought it did. Dante graduated college summa cum laude with a business degree. He'd been accepted to several graduate programs. He had job interviews lined up with consulting firms in the city. At his graduation ceremony last month, he hugged me tight and said, "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Mom. I'm going to make you proud." I believed him. God help me. I believed every word. When he moved back home temporarily to job hunt and figure out his next steps, I was thrilled. My successful, grateful, hard-working son was finally ready to launch into the world, and I'd be there to witness his takeoff. I gave him the guest room, converted my home office into his workspace, and even provided him with temporary access to our household accounts, so he could help with bills while I worked long shifts during flu season. "You've sacrificed enough," he told me. "Let me handle the boring stuff while you focus on work." It felt like such a gift. My responsible adult son stepping up to help his exhausted mother. It felt like validation of every sleepless night, every missed social event, every time I'd chosen his needs over mine. This was what I'd been working toward, a partnership, where Dante appreciated my sacrifices and wanted to give back. I was so proud of the man I'd raised. I bragged about him to my coworkers, showed off his graduation photos, and started making plans for how I'd spend my newfound free time once he moved into his own place with his fancy consulting job. My retirement account had grown to $43,000. Not a fortune, but enough to give me options. Maybe I could cut back to part-time work in a few years. Maybe I could take that trip to Ireland I'd been dreaming about since nursing school. Maybe I could finally think about my own future instead of constantly managing his. I felt like I was finally reaching the finish line of single motherhood. The impossible had been accomplished. I'd raised a successful, grateful son who understood the value of hard work and sacrifice. All those years of exhaustion and stress had paid off. All those times I'd questioned whether I was doing enough, being enough, giving enough. The answer was clear. I'd done it. We'd made it. Dante was home, safe, successful, and ready to build his own life on the foundation I'd provided. Our relationship was strong, built on 15 years of unconditional love and mutual respect. He trusted me enough to ask for advice, and I trusted him enough to give him access to our household finances. That trust felt like the ultimate reward for everything I'd endured. My son wasn't just successful. He was trustworthy. He wasn't just smart. He was grateful. He wasn't just my child. He was my partner in building a secure future for both of us. Or so I thought. Until I came home from that shift and saw $127 in my retirement account. Until I realized that the grateful, trustworthy young man I'd raised was actually a stranger who'd been calculating how to steal from me while I was out earning the money he was planning to take. Until I understood that 15 years of unconditional love had created not a grateful son, but an entitled thief who saw my sacrifices as his right to claim. The Diana Stone who walked into her house at 11:47 p.m. was a proud, tired, trusting mother who believed she'd successfully completed the hardest job in the world. The Diana Stone who discovered the theft at midnight was someone else entirely, someone who was about to learn that love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's enabling, and I was about to stop enabling forever. The discovery of the theft didn't happen all at once. It unfolded like a nightmare, in slow motion, each detail more devastating than the last. I should have gone straight to bed that night. God knows I was exhausted enough. 12 hours in the emergency ward during flu season had left me drained, my back aching from bending over patients, my mind foggy from the controlled chaos that is modern healthcare. All I wanted was to collapse into bed and forget about IVs and discharge papers and insurance hassles for a few blessed hours. But I had this routine, this monthly ritual that usually brought me comfort. Every few weeks, I'd check my retirement account before bed, watching that number slowly grow with each paycheck contribution. It wasn't much, a few hundred here, 1,000 there when I picked up overtime. But seeing that balance climb gave me hope. It reminded me that all the sacrifice was worth it, that I was building something solid for my future. That night, I sat down at my laptop in my kitchen, still wearing my scrubs, my hair escaping from its ponytail in tired wisps. I logged into my banking app while absently scrolling through my phone, checking for messages from Dante about his job interviews, half listening to the late-night news playing on the TV in the living room. The page loaded, and I glanced at the screen without really seeing it at first. Then my brain caught up with my eyes, and the world tilted sideways. 12743, I blinked hard, certain I was misreading the number. Maybe I'd clicked on the wrong account. Maybe the bank's website was glitching. Maybe exhaustion was making me hallucinate. I refreshed the page, my heart starting to hammer in my chest. $127,043. The same number. Exactly the same number. My retirement account, which had shown $43,017 just 2 weeks ago when I'd last checked it, was virtually empty. I stared at the screen, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. This had to be a mistake. Banks made mistakes all the time. Systems went down. Numbers got scrambled. There was a logical explanation that didn't involve my life savings disappearing into thin air. With trembling fingers, I clicked on the transaction history. The page took forever to load, or maybe time had just slowed down to a crawl. When it finally appeared, I saw my regular pattern of deposits and the occasional small withdrawal for emergencies. Everything looked normal until I reached today's date. There it was, a single transaction at 12:23 a.m., a transfer of $42,873.57 to an account I'd never seen before, with a reference number that meant nothing to me. The description simply read, "External transfer, crypto exchange, crypto exchange." My hand started shaking so violently that I could barely control the mouse. I clicked on the transaction details, hoping for more information, some clue that would make this make sense. But there was nothing, just a confirmation number and a time stamp, 12:23 a.m. While I was at the hospital, dealing with a car accident victim and comforting a family whose grandmother was dying, someone had stolen my entire retirement fund. But this wasn't some random hacker or identity thief. This transfer had been made from my home computer, using my login credentials, by someone who had access to my personal information. I looked at the timestamp again. 12:23 a.m. Last night. No, this morning, technically. I'd been at work until 11:30, and I'd driven straight home. Whoever did this had been in my house while I was gone, using my computer, accessing my most private financial information. But I lived alone, except for Dante. The thought hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs. I pushed back from the desk, actually gasping as if someone had punched me in the stomach. No, absolutely not. There was no way. Dante would never. He couldn't. He wouldn't. But even as my mind recoiled from the possibility, my nursing training kicked in. Look at the evidence. Follow the facts. Don't let emotion cloud your judgment. Fact: someone had accessed my computer at 12:23 a.m. while I was at work. Fact: only Dante had been home during that time. Fact: the money had been transferred to a cryptocurrency exchange. Fact: Dante had been talking about cryptocurrency investments for months, showing me articles about people getting rich from Bitcoin and Ethereum. I felt sick. Actually, physically nauseated. I rushed to the bathroom and dry heaved over the toilet, my body rejecting the reality my mind was being forced to accept. This couldn't be happening. Not Dante. Not my son. Not the boy I'd raised, the young man I'd sacrificed everything for. When the nausea passed, I walked back to my laptop on unsteady legs. I needed more proof. I needed to be absolutely certain before I could even begin to process what this meant. My computer automatically saved login credentials for most sites, a security risk I'd always meant to address but never found time for. If someone had accessed my banking from this computer, there would be a record in the browser history. My hands were still shaking as I opened the history tab and scrolled to early that morning. There it was. At 12:19 a.m., someone had visited my bank's website. At 12:21 a.m., they'd logged into my retirement account. At 12:23 a.m., they'd accessed the transfer function. At 12:27 a.m., they'd visited a cryptocurrency exchange website. 4 minutes. It had taken 4 minutes for someone to destroy 15 years of my financial planning. But I still needed absolute proof. I had a security camera app on my laptop. something I'd installed months ago when there had been break-ins in our neighborhood. I'd forgotten it was even there, running quietly in the background, recording everything that happened in front of my computer. I opened the app with fingers that could barely hit the right keys and scrolled back to 12:23 a.m. The timestamp matched exactly. And there he was, Dante, my son, sitting in my desk chair, wearing the Syracuse University t-shirt I'd bought him for Christmas, casually typing on my keyboard like he was checking the weather. His face was clearly visible in the laptop's camera, concentrated but not nervous, methodical but not hesitant. He looked like someone paying bills or answering emails, routine, unremarkable, completely at ease. I watched in horror as he navigated to my bank account with the confidence of someone who'd done this before. No fumbling with passwords, no hesitation about which accounts to access. He moved through the transfer process like he'd practiced it, like he'd been planning this. The worst part was his expression. There was no guilt, no anxiety, no indication that he understood he was committing a crime against his own mother. He looked focused, almost excited, like he was doing something clever rather than something devastating. I watched him complete the transfer, then immediately navigate to a cryptocurrency exchange and begin setting up an account with my stolen money. I watched him create login credentials, accept terms and conditions, and begin purchasing something called Doge Moon, apparently some kind of speculative cryptocurrency that promised enormous returns. The timestamp showed that the entire process took less than 30 minutes. By 12:47 a.m., he was done. He'd stolen my retirement fund, converted it to cryptocurrency, and gone to bed, all while I was at the hospital saving lives. I sat staring at the frozen image of my son, caught in the act of destroying my financial security. This wasn't a moment of poor judgment or a desperate mistake. This was calculated theft, planned and executed, with the kind of cold efficiency that suggested he'd been thinking about it for a while. But I still couldn't fully accept it. Some part of me was still scrambling for alternative explanations. Maybe he was going to surprise me. Maybe he'd planned to triple the money and put it back before I noticed. Maybe this was some kind of misguided attempt to help our financial situation. I needed to hear it from him. I needed to look him in the eye and give him a chance to explain, because despite everything I'd just discovered, he was still my son, the boy I'd rocked to sleep, taught to ride a bike, cheered for at tennis matches, the young man whose graduation photos were still sitting on my kitchen counter. I walked down the hallway to his bedroom, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. Light was still seeping under his door, probably from his phone or laptop. I stood outside for a moment, trying to figure out what to say, how to begin this conversation that would change everything between us forever. Finally, I knocked, 3 soft raps that sounded deafening in the quiet house. "Dante, I need to talk to you." I heard rustling, the sound of someone moving quickly, possibly closing a laptop or hiding something. Then footsteps, and the door opened to reveal my son looking guilty before I'd even spoken. His face was flushed, his hair messy, his eyes wide with what I now recognized as panic. "Mom, is everything okay? You're home late." Already lying, already calculating, already trying to turn this around and make me the one who needed to explain myself. "I need to talk to you about something," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "Can you come to the kitchen?" Sure. Just let me..." He gestured vaguely toward his room, probably wanting to close whatever websites he still had open. "Now, Dante." Something in my tone must have warned him that this wasn't a casual conversation. His face went from guilty to truly frightened, and I saw him swallow hard before nodding. We walked to the kitchen in silence. I sat down at my laptop, the banking website still open, the security footage still paused on his face. He stood behind me, and I could feel his tension radiating like heat. "My retirement money is gone," I said quietly, not turning around to look at him. The silence stretched between us, thick with all the words neither of us wanted to say. I could hear him breathing, quick and shallow, like he was trying not to hyperventilate. "Mom, I can explain," he finally said, his voice cracking like it had when he was 13, and trying to explain why he'd broken the neighbor's window with a baseball. "I can explain. Not, I don't know what you're talking about. Not, that's impossible. Not, let me help you figure out what happened. Just, I can explain," which was as good as a confession. I turned around slowly to face him. His face was white except for 2 bright spots of red on his cheeks. His hands were trembling slightly, and he kept glancing toward the door like he was calculating whether he could run. "Then explain," I said. The story came out in pieces, interrupted by stammering and backtracking and desperate attempts to make it sound better than it was. He'd been researching cryptocurrency investments for months. He'd found what he called a sure thing, some new coin that was supposed to increase in value by 500% within weeks. He'd been watching it, waiting for the right moment to invest. "I was going to put the money back before you even noticed," he said, his words tumbling over each other. "It was supposed to be a quick flip. Buy low, sell high, put your money back plus extra. I was trying to help our financial situation by stealing from me. I wasn't stealing. I was investing. I was going to give you back more than I took. Without asking me, without my permission. Using money I've been saving for 15 years. He started crying then, not the dignified tears of remorse, but the messy, desperate sobbing of someone who'd been caught and was just beginning to understand the magnitude of what they'd done. "The investment went wrong," he choked out between sobs. "Doge Moon crashed right after I bought it. Some kind of exit scam. The developers disappeared and took everyone's money. I lost everything in 6 hours. Everything. He'd lost everything. 15 years of my sacrifice, gone in 6 hours because my college-educated son had gambled my retirement fund on something called Doge Moon. "You stole my future," I whispered, the words scraping my throat raw. "Every extra shift I worked, every Christmas I spent at the hospital instead of home with you, every time I chose to put money in savings instead of buying something I wanted, you threw it all away on gambling. It wasn't gambling, it was investing. Cryptocurrency is the future, Mom. I've been studying this stuff for months. I know what I'm doing." "You knew what you were doing?" My voice was rising now. 15 years of suppressed exhaustion and frustration, finally finding an outlet. "You knew what you were doing when you stole my banking passwords. You knew what you were doing when you accessed my retirement account without permission. You knew what you were doing when you bet my life savings on something called Doge Moon. I was trying to help. You were trying to help yourself. You saw an opportunity to gamble with someone else's money, and you took it because you knew I'd always bail you out. Because you knew Diana would fix it. Diana would handle it. Diana would sacrifice whatever she needed to sacrifice to make your problems go away." The truth was pouring out of me now. Years of enablement and boundary crossing that I'd disguised as love finally revealed for what it really was. "You've never faced a real consequence in your life, Dante. Never. When you crashed my car, I replaced it. When you failed organic chemistry, I hired tutors. When you wanted to switch majors, I supported it even though we'd wasted thousands on science courses. I've spent 23 years protecting you from every possible discomfort, and this is what it created. a person who thinks other people's sacrifices belong to him. He was still crying, but I could see anger starting to mix with the remorse. I'm sorry, okay? I'm really, really sorry. But you can't act like I'm some kind of monster. I made a mistake. One mistake. One mistake? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. This wasn't a mistake, Dante. This was a choice. You chose to go into my computer. You chose to access my banking. You chose to steal my money. You chose to gamble it away. Those weren't mistakes. They were decisions, and every single one of them was selfish and dishonest and cruel. I stood up from my chair, suddenly feeling like I was seeing my son clearly for the first time in years. This wasn't the grateful, hard-working young man I thought I'd raised. This was a stranger who'd been living in my house, eating my food, and apparently planning to steal my money while I worked to support him. I need you to leave, I said quietly. What? I need you to pack a bag and leave. Tonight. I can't look at you right now. Mom, please, let's talk about this. Let's figure out how to fix it. I'll get a job. I'll pay you back. I'll do whatever it takes. With what money, Dante? You just lost $43,000 in 6 hours. You don't have a job, you don't have any savings, and now you don't have a trust fund either. He looked confused. What do you mean I don't have a trust fund? I smiled then, but it wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of someone who'd just realized they held all the cards in a game they'd been losing for years. You'll find out in the morning, I said. Now pack a bag and leave. I can't stand to be in the same house with you right now. He left. He actually left, throwing clothes into a duffel bag while protesting his innocence and promising to make everything right. He called me heartless and unfair and cruel. He said I was overreacting, that families were supposed to forgive each other, that he'd never expected his own mother to throw him out over money. But he left, and as I watched his taillights disappear down our street at 2:47 a.m., I felt something I hadn't experienced in 15 years, complete clarity about what needed to happen next. Dante had just learned that actions have consequences. Tomorrow morning, he was going to learn that some consequences last forever. After Dante left, I sat alone in my kitchen at 3:17 a.m., surrounded by the wreckage of everything I thought I knew about my life. The house felt different, not just quiet, but hollow, like something essential had been ripped out of it. The coffee mug he'd left on the counter that morning, the Syracuse University sweatshirt draped over the back of his chair, the stack of job application printouts on the kitchen table. All of it looked like evidence from a crime scene now. But as I sat there in the fluorescent light, still wearing my wrinkled scrubs, something unexpected happened. Instead of collapsing into grief or rage, or the kind of maternal panic that had driven my decisions for the past 15 years, I felt something I hadn't experienced since the night Richard left. Absolute crystal clear certainty about what needed to happen next. The shock was wearing off, and in its place was a cold, analytical calm that surprised me. Maybe it was my medical training kicking in. Assess the situation, identify the problem, develop a treatment plan. Maybe it was just exhaustion, finally giving way to clarity. Or maybe it was the relief of finally seeing the truth about the dynamic I'd created with my son. I made a pot of coffee and began to really think about what had just happened. Not just the theft, but the years of enabling that had led to it. When Dante was 17 and crashed my car on black ice, I'd replaced it within a week without making him contribute a penny. I told myself it was because he was just a kid, because accidents happen, because I didn't want him to feel guilty about something that wasn't entirely his fault. But what message had I really sent? That Diana would always fix his mistakes, that there were no real consequences for poor judgment as long as Mom was around to clean up the mess. When he'd struggled with organic chemistry his freshman year, I'd hired a private tutor for $75 an hour without even asking him to contribute from his part-time job money. When he'd decided to switch majors 6 months later, making all those expensive science courses worthless, I'd supported the decision unconditionally. "Your happiness matters more than money," I'd told him, and I'd meant it. But what I'd really taught him was that my money was always available for his changing whims, that financial consequences didn't apply to him. When he'd come home from college with expensive tastes, designer clothes, the latest technology, plans for spring break trips that cost more than I made in a month, I'd figured out ways to help fund them. He works hard, I'd told myself. He deserves nice things. But what I'd really been doing was teaching him that he deserved things without having to fully pay for them himself. Sitting in my kitchen that night, I realized I'd been enabling Dante's sense of entitlement for years. Every time I'd cushioned a fall, covered a cost, or smoothed over a consequence, I'd been sending the same message. Dante Stone doesn't have to face the full reality of his choices, because Diana Stone will always be there to soften the impact, and now that enabling had reached its logical conclusion. My son had stolen my retirement fund because on some level he'd been conditioned to believe that my resources were his resources. He'd gambled with my future because he'd never truly understood that actions have lasting consequences. He'd betrayed my trust because I'd never given him a reason to believe that trust, once broken, might not be easily repaired. I thought about my own childhood, raised by parents who believed in natural consequences and personal responsibility. When I'd made poor choices as a teenager, I'd face the results. When I'd spent my summer job money foolishly, I'd gone without things I wanted until I'd earned more. When I'd failed a test because I hadn't studied, my parents had sympathized, but hadn't hired tutors or lobbied teachers for extra credit opportunities. Those consequences had taught me valuable lessons, that money was finite, that preparation mattered, that other people weren't responsible for fixing my mistakes. They'd been painful at the time, but they'd built character and resilience that had served me well when Richard left, and I'd had to rebuild my life from scratch. But I'd been so determined to give Dante a different childhood, one without the financial stress and emotional uncertainty I'd experienced, that I'd swung completely in the opposite direction. Instead of teaching him to handle difficulty, I'd taught him to avoid it. Instead of building his resilience, I'd become his permanent safety net. And now, at 23 years old, he was completely unprepared for a world that wouldn't constantly bail him out, forgive his mistakes, and prioritize his comfort over everything else. As the sun began to rise outside my kitchen window, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I was going to stop enabling Dante immediately and completely, not gradually, not with warnings and second chances, but with the kind of swift, decisive action that would force him to confront reality for the first time in his adult life. But this wasn't going to be about revenge, though I'll admit the thought of punishment felt satisfying in that moment. This was going to be about finally teaching my son the lessons I should have been teaching him all along, that trust, once broken, has to be rebuilt through actions, not words, that financial security is earned, not inherited, that other people's sacrifices are gifts, not entitlements. At 5:30 a.m., I opened my laptop and navigated to a website I'd bookmarked years ago but never used, the management portal for Dante's trust fund. I'd started the trust fund when Dante was 8 years old, just after Richard left. Every month, I'd contributed whatever I could afford, sometimes $50, sometimes $500 when I picked up extra shifts. I'd invested carefully, reinvesting the dividends, taking advantage of compound interest. Over 15 years, that fund had grown to $180,000. The original plan had been to give Dante access to the fund when he turned 25, enough money to make a substantial down payment on a house, or start a business, or pursue graduate school without debt. It represented everything I'd hoped to give him: security, opportunity, and the freedom to take risks, because he had a financial foundation. But as I looked at the balance that morning, I realized I'd been thinking about it all wrong. That money wasn't a gift to my son. It was a reward for behavior I'd never required. I'd been planning to hand him $180,000, not because he'd earned it through responsibility, gratitude, and good judgment, but simply because he was my child. Well, being my child wasn't enough anymore. If Dante wanted financial security, he was going to have to demonstrate that he could handle it responsibly. And given that he'd just stolen my retirement fund to gamble on cryptocurrency, that demonstration was going to take a while. A long while. I spent the next hour researching my options for the trust fund. The good news was that I'd structured it carefully years ago, maintaining full control as the trustee until Dante reached certain milestones. I could modify the terms, change the beneficiaries, or even dissolve it entirely if I chose to. The question was what to do with the money. My first instinct was to simply keep it, to move it to my own retirement account as compensation for what Dante had stolen. But that felt too much like revenge, and revenge wouldn't teach him anything except that his mother was vindictive. Then I remembered something that had been weighing on my mind for months. A conversation with my colleague Janet about her daughter's struggles as a young single mother. Janet's daughter was working 2 jobs while going to nursing school, trying to save enough money for childcare and textbooks, while supporting her toddler son. She was brilliant and hardworking, but the financial pressure was overwhelming. "She's exactly where I was 15 years ago," Janet had said. Exhausted, scared, but determined to build a better life for her kid. I just wish there was more help available for women in her situation. That's when the idea hit me. Instead of keeping the trust fund money or simply punishing Dante by taking it away, I could use it to help people who actually deserved support, people who were working hard, making sacrifices, and still struggling to build security for their families. I spent the next 2 hours researching scholarship programs for children of single mothers. I found several organizations that provided educational funding for kids whose parents were working multiple jobs to make ends meet, the kind of kids who understood the value of every dollar, because they'd watched their mothers stretch those dollars to cover necessities. By 7 a.m., I'd made my decision. Dante's trust fund was going to become the Diana Stone Scholarship Fund for children of single mothers. The money would go to kids who actually understood sacrifice, who appreciated opportunity, who wouldn't take financial gifts for granted because they'd seen their parents work themselves to exhaustion just to keep the lights on. But before I could make that change, I needed to call my estate attorney, Patricia Weaver. Patricia had helped me set up the trust fund originally, and she'd need to handle the legal paperwork for transferring the assets. I left her a voicemail at 7:15 a.m., knowing she wouldn't be in her office yet, but needing to get the process started. "Patricia, it's Diana Stone. I need to make some urgent changes to my son's trust fund. Can you call me back as soon as possible? I'll explain everything when we talk, but I need to move quickly on this." Next, I called my bank's fraud department to report the theft of my retirement funds. I knew this would trigger a criminal investigation. And I knew Dante would likely face charges. Part of me, the mother part, felt sick about involving the police in our family crisis. But the practical part of me, the part that had been making difficult decisions for 15 years, knew it was necessary. "I need to report a theft from my retirement account," I told the representative. "The person who did it is my adult son, and I have video evidence of the crime." The conversation that followed was painful but straightforward. They'd freeze any remaining cryptocurrency assets associated with the transaction, investigate the transfer, and likely refer the case to local law enforcement. There would be paperwork, interviews, and probably a court case if Dante didn't admit guilt immediately. "Are you sure you want to proceed with criminal charges against your son, Co?" the representative asked gently. I closed my eyes and thought about all the times I'd asked myself similar questions. "Are you sure you want to hire another tutor instead of letting him fail? Are you sure you want to replace his car instead of making him deal with the consequences of his accident? Are you sure you want to support his major change instead of making him commit to his original plan?" For 15 years, I'd chosen the easy path, the path that protected Dante from discomfort and shielded him from consequences. And look where it had led us. "Yes," I said firmly, "I'm sure." The final step was the hardest one, calling Dante's potential employers to inform them about the criminal investigation. He'd mentioned 3 companies that were considering him for positions, and while I didn't have contact information for all of them, I knew I could reach at least one, through my friend Rachel, whose husband worked in consulting. This felt like the cruelest cut, destroying his job prospects just when he was trying to launch his career. But I also knew that these companies deserved to know they were considering hiring someone who was under criminal investigation for financial theft. If I were hiring someone to handle client accounts and budgets, I'd want to know if they'd recently stolen money from their own family. By 8 a.m., I'd made all the necessary calls and set all the wheels in motion. Dante's trust fund would be transferred to the scholarship program within a few days. The criminal investigation into the theft of my retirement funds had been officially opened. His job prospects had been effectively destroyed. In 8 hours, I'd systematically dismantled every assumption Dante had about his financial future and his freedom from consequences. The young man who'd gone to sleep thinking he was clever enough to steal and gamble with his mother's money was about to wake up in a world where actions had permanent, life-altering results. But as I finally headed to my bedroom to try to get a few hours of sleep, I didn't feel vindictive or angry. I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, confident that I was finally doing the right thing as a mother. For the first time since Richard left, I was teaching my son what I should have been teaching him all along, that the world doesn't owe him anything, that trust has to be earned, and that some mistakes have consequences that can't be fixed by a loving mother's willingness to sacrifice. The Diana Stone who had enabled and protected and cushioned every fall was gone. In her place was a woman who understood that real love sometimes requires letting the people you care about face the full weight of their choices. Dante was about to learn what that kind of love looked like, and honestly, it was long overdue. At exactly 7:05 a.m., I knocked on the door of the guest room where Dante had been staying for the past month. I'd managed exactly 2 hours of sleep, but I felt more alert and focused than I had in years. In my hand was a manila envelope containing the legal documents that would change both of our lives forever. The sun was streaming through the hallway windows, casting everything in sharp relief. Appropriate, I thought, for a conversation that was going to bring 15 years of enabling into brutal focus. I could hear movement inside the room, the sound of someone stirring reluctantly from sleep. "Dante," I called through the door, "we need to finish our conversation." There was a long pause, then the shuffle of feet on hardwood and the sound of the door unlocking. When it opened, my son looked like he'd aged 5 years overnight. His hair was sticking up at odd angles, his eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion and stress, and his face had the grayish pallor of someone who'd spent hours staring at the ceiling, realizing the magnitude of what they'd done. For a moment, looking at his haggard appearance, I felt the familiar maternal instinct to comfort him, to smooth over the crisis and find a way to make everything okay. This was my baby, after all, the little boy I'd rocked through countless nights, the teenager I'd cheered for at tennis matches, the young man whose graduation photos were still proudly displayed throughout our house. But then I remembered the security footage of him calmly stealing my retirement fund, and that moment of weakness passed. "Mom," he started, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "I've been thinking all night about what happened, and We need to talk in the kitchen," I interrupted. "There are some things you need to know." He followed me down the hallway, moving like someone walking to their own execution. I could feel his anxiety radiating behind me, and I knew he was preparing another round of apologies, explanations, and promises to make everything right. In the kitchen, I gestured for him to sit at the table while I remained standing. The power dynamic was intentional. I was done being the supportive mother who sat across from him as an equal while he explained away his mistakes. This was going to be a very different kind of conversation. "I have something for you," I said, placing the manila envelope on the table in front of him. He looked at it with confusion and hope warring on his face. "What is it? Open it." His hands were shaking as he tore open the envelope and pulled out the legal documents inside. I watched his expression change as he read, confusion giving way to disbelief, then horror, then something approaching panic. "I don't understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. This says you're dissolving my trust fund?" "Not dissolving it," I corrected. "Transferring it. Every penny of that $180,000 is now going to the Diana Stone Scholarship Fund for children of single mothers." The papers fluttered in his trembling hands as he looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Complete, devastating shock. "You can't do this," he said, but there was no conviction in his voice. "That money was mine. You set it up for me. It's my inheritance." "It was never yours, Dante. It was money I saved and invested for your future, contingent on you becoming the kind of person who deserved that gift. As of last night, it became clear that you haven't earned it." He was scanning the documents frantically, looking for some loophole or technicality that would undo what I'd done. "This is insane. You're destroying my future over one mistake." "One mistake?" I kept my voice level, but I could feel 15 years of suppressed frustration boiling underneath. "Let me explain to you what happened last night, Dante, because I don't think you fully understand." I sat down across from him then, but not as his supportive mother. I sat down as someone preparing to deliver a verdict. "Last night, while I was at the hospital working a 12-hour shift to save other people's lives, you went into my computer and stole $43,000 from my retirement account. Not borrowed, not asked for. Stole. You took money I've been saving for 15 years, money from every extra shift I worked while you were growing up, every Christmas I spent at the hospital instead of home with you, every vacation I didn't take and every luxury I didn't buy because I was building a secure future for both of us. Mom, I'm not finished." My voice carried the authority I used in the emergency room when lives were on the line. "You took that money and gambled it on something called Doge Moon, not a legitimate investment, not a carefully researched opportunity. You bet my life savings on cryptocurrency you'd read about online, and you lost everything in 6 hours." He was crying again, but these weren't the manipulative tears of someone trying to escape consequences. These were the tears of someone finally understanding the magnitude of what they'd destroyed. "But the worst part," I continued, "wasn't the theft itself. It was the planning that went into it. The security footage shows you weren't nervous or hesitant. You moved through my banking system like you'd been thinking about this for a while. You knew my passwords, you knew which accounts had money, and you knew exactly how to cover your tracks." I was going to put it back. "With what money, Dante? You lost everything in 6 hours. There was no plan to put it back, because there was no money left to put back." I reached across the table and tapped the legal documents. "So yes, I've transferred your trust fund to a scholarship program. Know why? Because that money is going to kids who actually understand sacrifice. Kids whose mothers work 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. Kids who appreciate opportunities because they've watched their parents struggle for every dollar." The reality was sinking in now. I could see it in his face, the slow recognition that this wasn't a temporary punishment or an emotional reaction he could wait out. This was permanent. "I've also filed criminal charges against you for the theft of my retirement funds," I continued. "The police will probably want to interview you within the next few days." His face went white. "Criminal charges? Mom, you can't. I'm your son." "You're an adult who committed a felony against another adult. The fact that we're related doesn't change the legal reality of what you did." "But what about my job interviews? What about my future?" "What about them? You should have thought about your future before you stole money from your mother." The tears were coming harder now, and he was beginning to hyperventilate. "This is insane. This is completely insane. You're destroying my entire life over money." "I'm not destroying your life, Dante. You destroyed your life. I'm just refusing to fix it for you." I stood up then, looking down at my son as he sat hunched over the legal documents, finally understanding that the safety net he'd taken for granted his entire life was gone. "For 23 years, I've protected you from every consequence, covered every mistake, and cushioned every fall. When you crashed my car, I replaced it without making you contribute a penny. When you failed organic chemistry, I hired expensive tutors instead of letting you face academic probation. When you wanted to change majors, I supported it even though we'd wasted thousands on courses you no longer needed. You did those things because you love me. I did those things because I thought I was helping you. But what I was really doing was teaching you that Diana Stone would always be there to fix your problems, that other people's money was available for your mistakes, and that you never had to face the real consequences of your choices." I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the neighborhood where I'd raised him, the streets where he'd learned to ride a bike, the yard where we'd played catch on summer evenings when I got home from work. "Last night, you proved that all those years of protection created exactly what I was afraid it would. A person who feels entitled to other people's sacrifices, who thinks theft is acceptable if you call it investing, and who believes love means never having to face consequences." When I turned back to face him, Dante was staring at me like I was a stranger. "So here's what's going to happen," I said. "You're going to find somewhere else to live while you deal with the criminal charges. You're going to get a job, any job, and start learning what it actually means to support yourself. And you're going to begin the long process of figuring out how to rebuild the trust you destroyed. What if I can't find a place to stay? What if I can't get a job because of the criminal charges? What if—" "Then you'll figure it out. The same way I figured out how to rebuild my life when your father left. the same way millions of people figure out how to survive when they don't have someone else's money to fall back on. The look on his face was breaking my heart, but I forced myself to remember the security footage of him stealing my retirement fund. This was necessary. This was what I should have done years ago. "This isn't fair," he whispered. Fair? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Was it fair when you stole 15 years of my savings? Was it fair when you gambled away my retirement security? Was it fair when you violated my trust while I was at work saving other people's lives? I made a mistake. You made a choice, a series of choices, and now you get to live with the consequences of those choices without me cushioning the fall. I picked up the legal documents and put them back in the envelope. Your trust fund transfer will be finalized by Friday. The scholarship program will start accepting applications next month. At least some good will come from all the money I've spent trying to give you a secure future. Mom, please, we can work through this. We can figure out a payment plan. I can get a job and pay you back slowly. Please don't do this to me. I'm not doing this to you, Dante. I'm finally doing what I should have been doing all along, letting you face reality. I walked toward the kitchen door, then stopped and turned back to him one last time. I love you. I will always love you. But I will never again protect you from the consequences of your own choices. If you want to rebuild our relationship, if you want to earn back my trust, if you want to create a real future for yourself, you're going to have to do it without my money, without my safety net, and without the assumption that Diana Stone will fix whatever you break. What if I can't do it? What if I fail? Then you'll fail, and you'll learn from it, and you'll get back up, and you'll try again. Just like everyone else who doesn't have a mother, willing to bankrupt herself to prevent her adult child from experiencing discomfort. I left him sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the legal documents that had just changed his life forever. As I walked down the hallway to my bedroom, I could hear him crying, not the manipulative tears he'd used to get out of trouble as a child, but the raw, devastated sobbing of someone who just realized that their entire understanding of how the world worked was wrong. It was the sound of someone finally growing up, and as heartbreaking as it was to hear, I knew it was the sound I'd been waiting 15 years to hear. The sound of my son finally learning that actions have consequences, that trust must be earned, and that love doesn't mean rescuing someone from every mistake they make. The Dante who'd stolen my retirement fund was about to discover what life was like without a trust fund, without family financial support, and without someone else to blame for his problems. The Diana Stone who'd enabled his entitled behavior for 23 years was gone. In her place was a mother who finally understood that the most loving thing she could do was let her son face the reality of his choices, no matter how much it hurt both of them. The transformation was complete. Now we'd both have to live with the consequences. The first month after that morning conversation was the hardest period of my life since Richard left 15 years earlier. Not because of the financial stress, though rebuilding my retirement fund at 52 was daunting, but because of the complete radio silence from Dante and the constant questioning of whether I'd made the right choice. Every maternal instinct I'd developed over 23 years was screaming at me to check on him, to make sure he was safe, to offer some kind of help or support. I found myself reaching for my phone dozens of times a day, wanting to text him, to see how he was managing, to make sure he wasn't sleeping on the street or going hungry. But I didn't. For the first time in his adult life, I let Dante face his problems without my intervention. Through mutual friends and my sister Carla, I learned fragments of information about his situation. He'd moved in with his college friend Marcus. sleeping on a couch in a cramped apartment across town. The criminal charges had indeed scared away his potential employers. Apparently, consulting firms aren't eager to hire people under investigation for financial theft. He'd found work at a warehouse, loading trucks for minimum wage on the overnight shift. "He looks terrible," Carla reported after running into him at the grocery store. "Skinny, exhausted, like he hasn't been sleeping well. Are you sure you don't want to—" "No," I interrupted. "I'm not going to rescue him from this." But saying it was easier than believing it. There were nights when I lay awake wondering if I'd been too harsh, if destroying his trust fund had been motivated by revenge rather than love, if there might have been a middle ground that would have taught him responsibility without devastating his future. Then I'd remember the security footage of him calmly stealing my retirement money, and my resolve would strengthen. This wasn't about punishment. It was about finally teaching him lessons I should have taught years earlier. The criminal case moved forward slowly but inevitably. Dante eventually pleaded guilty to financial theft in exchange for probation and restitution requirements. The court ordered him to pay back the stolen money, all $42,873, at a rate of $500 per month, until the debt was satisfied. At his warehouse salary, that payment represented nearly half his take-home income. Meanwhile, I threw myself into rebuilding my own financial security. I picked up extra shifts whenever possible, started a small side business doing telehealth consultations in the evenings, and began seriously researching investment strategies that could help me recover what I'd lost. For the first time in 15 years, every dollar I earned was mine to save and invest, not subject to being diverted toward Dante's latest need or crisis. It was liberating in a way I hadn't expected. I'd spent so many years defining myself through my son's needs and achievements that I'd forgotten what it felt like to prioritize my own goals. I bought myself a new pair of running shoes, the first non-work-related purchase I'd made for myself in months. I started taking a pottery class on Thursday evenings. Small things, but they represented a fundamental shift in how I viewed my time and money. The Diana Stone Scholarship Fund began accepting applications 3 months after I'd transferred Dante's trust money. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of applications from children of single mothers, kids who understood sacrifice because they'd watched their parents work multiple jobs just to keep the family afloat. Reading those applications was both heartbreaking and inspiring. These were teenagers who worked after-school jobs to help with family expenses, who chose community college over 4-year universities because they couldn't afford to take on debt, who wrote essays about their mothers with a gratitude and appreciation that made me wonder if I'd ever heard those sentiments from Dante. One application particularly stood out. A 17-year-old named Maya, whose mother was a nurse's aide working 3 part-time jobs to support Maya and her younger brother. Maya had maintained a 4.0 GPA while working 20 hours a week at a local restaurant, and her essay about watching her mother come home exhausted every night, but still help with homework, brought tears to my eyes. "My mom sacrifices everything for us," Maya had written. "She never complains, never says she's too tired, never makes us feel like we're a burden. I want to become a doctor so I can give her the life she deserves, the life she never had because she was too busy giving us everything we needed." That was gratitude. That was appreciation. That was the understanding of sacrifice that I'd hoped to instill in Dante, but somehow never had. The scholarship program awarded its first grants 6 months after the trust fund transfer. Maya received a full scholarship to the state university's pre-med program. 12 other children of single mothers received smaller grants to help with college expenses, trade school tuition, or community college costs. At the scholarship ceremony, I met these kids and their mothers. I saw exhausted women who reminded me of myself 15 years earlier, working multiple jobs, making impossible budgets stretch, sacrificing their own needs for their children's futures. But I also saw something I'd never seen in my relationship with Dante. Children who truly understood and appreciated what their mothers were doing for them. "Thank you for this opportunity," Maya said when she shook my hand at the ceremony. My mom cried when I told her about the scholarship. She said it was the first time in years that someone else recognized how hard single mothers work. Standing in that room full of grateful families, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, certainty that I'd made the right choice. Dante's trust fund money was doing exactly what I'd hoped, supporting people who genuinely appreciated the gift and would use it responsibly. But the real test of my decision came 8 months after that confrontation in my kitchen, when Dante finally reached out. It was a Sunday morning in March when my doorbell rang. I opened the door to find my son standing on the porch, looking nothing like the entitled young man who'd stolen my retirement fund. He was thinner, his face weathered by months of physical labor and financial stress. His clothes were clean but worn, and he was holding a small envelope in his hands. "Hi, Mom," he said quietly. "Can we talk?" My first instinct was to throw my arms around him, to drag him inside and feed him and ask about everything he'd been through. But I forced myself to step back and really look at him. This wasn't the same person who'd left my house 8 months earlier. Something fundamental had changed. "Of course," I said, gesturing for him to come in. We sat in the living room, not the kitchen where we'd had our last devastating conversation, but the comfortable space where we'd spent countless evenings during his childhood, reading together or watching movies or just talking about his day. "I brought you something," he said, holding out the envelope. Inside was a check for $500, made out in his careful handwriting. "It's my first restitution payment," he explained. "I know I owe you a lot more than this, but it's a start. I wanted to deliver it in person because I owe you more than just money." I looked at the check, $500 that probably represented weeks of careful budgeting and sacrifice on his minimum wage salary. It was more meaningful than any gift he'd ever given me. "I owe you an apology," he continued, "not just for stealing your money, but for never understanding what you went through to provide for me. I've been working at the warehouse for 7 months now, trying to make rent and buy groceries and save money for restitution payments, and I finally get it." His voice was different, quieter, more measured, without the entitled defensiveness that had characterized our interactions for years. "I understand now what it means to choose between paying bills and buying something you want. I understand what it's like to work when you're exhausted and your body hurts and you just want to stay in bed. I understand what it means to have someone counting on you, trusting you, and knowing you can't let them down." He paused, looking around the living room where he'd grown up, his eyes taking in the photos of his childhood, the furniture I'd saved for years to buy, the home I'd worked so hard to maintain. "I never thanked you," he said. "Not really. I said the word sometimes, but I never really understood what I was thanking you for. I thought it was normal to have a mother who worked extra shifts to pay for my tennis lessons. I thought it was normal to have college paid for without having to take loans. I thought it was normal to always have someone fix my mistakes. And now?" I asked. "Now I know that nothing about what you did was normal. It was extraordinary. It was sacrifice on a level I never comprehended." He looked directly at me for the first time since he'd arrived. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry for stealing from you. But I'm more sorry for never appreciating what you were giving me in the first place." We talked for 3 hours that day. He told me about his life over the past 8 months, the shock of having to budget every dollar, The physical exhaustion of warehouse work, the humiliation of having his job applications rejected because of his criminal record. But he also told me about unexpected discoveries, the satisfaction of earning his own money, the pride he felt when he made his first rent payment entirely from his own wages, the relationships he'd built with coworkers who were also struggling to make ends meet. "I have a roommate now," he said, "another guy from the warehouse. His name is Carlos, and he's supporting his sick mother on warehouse wages. He sends her half his paycheck every month, and he never complains about it. Never acts like it's unfair or like someone else should help. He just does it because she's his mother, and she needs help." I could see Dante thinking about the contrast between Carlos's situation and his own past behavior. "Carlos talks about his mother the way I should have talked about you," he said, "like she's a hero, like her sacrifices are gifts, not obligations." Before he left that day, I asked him about his plans for the future. "I'm going to keep working and paying restitution," he said. "I'm also taking accounting classes at the community college at night. I want to learn how to really manage money, how to invest properly, how to build something legitimate instead of gambling on get-rich-quick schemes." "What about the trust fund?" I asked. "Do you resent what I did with it?" He was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. "I was angry at first," he admitted, "really angry. I felt like you'd stolen my future the same way I'd stolen your retirement money. But then I met some of the scholarship recipients at a community event, and I realized something." "What?" "They deserved that money more than I did. They were grateful for opportunities I'd taken for granted. They understood sacrifice in a way I never had. Maya, the pre-med student, works 2 jobs while maintaining a 4.0 GPA, and she talks about her mother like she's a saint. That money is doing more good for them than it ever would have done for me." That conversation marked the beginning of a slow rebuilding process between us. Dante continued making his restitution payments every month, always delivering them in person, always updating me on his progress toward financial independence. He graduated from community college with an accounting certificate and found a better job at a small business, helping them with their books and tax preparation. 2 years after our crisis, he moved into his own apartment, a small 1-bedroom place he could afford on his salary. He invited me over for dinner, cooking the meal himself, and proudly showing off his carefully managed budget spreadsheet. "I know it's not much," he said, gesturing around the modest space, "but it's mine. I earned everything in it." Looking around his apartment, the second-hand furniture he'd saved for, the small TV he'd bought after months of setting aside money, the framed photo of us from his high school graduation that he'd kept despite everything, I felt prouder of him than I ever had during his years of academic achievement. This was real success. A young man taking responsibility for his own life, building something through his own effort, understanding the value of money because he'd earned every dollar himself. Our relationship now is different from what it was during his childhood, but it's also stronger. It's built on mutual respect rather than financial dependence, on genuine appreciation rather than entitled expectation. When Dante thanks me now for something I did during his childhood, the gratitude feels real because he understands what sacrifice looks like. He finished paying his restitution last month, $873 over 4 years, exactly what he'd stolen from my retirement account. But more importantly, he'd rebuilt the trust he'd destroyed, not through words or promises, but through consistent action over years. At my 55th birthday party this year, Dante gave a toast that brought me to tears. 5 years ago, I thought I knew what love looked like, he said to the gathered friends and family. I thought love meant always being protected from consequences, always having someone fix my mistakes, always getting what I wanted without having to earn it. He looked directly at me across the room. But my mom taught me that real love sometimes means letting someone you care about face the results of their choices, even when it breaks your heart to watch. Real love means building character instead of just providing comfort. Real love means preparing someone for the world as it actually is, not as we wish it could be. He raised his glass. To Diana Stone, who loved me enough to let me fail, and who gave me the greatest gift a parent can give a child, the chance to become someone worth respecting. As I looked around that room, at my son who'd learned the value of responsibility, at my sister who'd supported me through the hardest decision of my parenting life, at friends who'd watched our family transform, I realized something profound. I'd spent 15 years trying to give Dante everything I thought he needed: financial security, educational opportunities, protection from hardship. But the most valuable thing I'd ever given him was the lesson I'd been afraid to teach: that love doesn't mean rescuing someone from every consequence, that character is built through facing difficulty, and that the greatest gift a parent can give a child is the confidence that they can handle whatever life throws at them. The Diana Stone who'd enabled and protected and cushioned every fall was gone. In her place was a mother who understood that real love requires boundaries, that trust must be earned, and that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is refuse to make their life easier. Dante had lost his trust fund, but he'd gained something more valuable: the knowledge that he could build a life through his own effort, that he could earn respect through his own choices, and that he could create security through his own work. I'd lost my retirement savings, but I'd gained something I hadn't even known I was missing: a son who truly appreciated what family meant, who understood the weight of sacrifice, and who had become someone worthy of the love I'd always felt for him. The Scholarship Fund continues to help children of single mothers pursue their dreams. Maya is now in her 3rd year of medical school, still working part-time but with a clear path toward her goal of becoming a doctor. Dozens of other kids have received help with their education, all of them understanding that the opportunity they've been given is a gift to be treasured, not an entitlement to be expected. Sometimes the most expensive lessons are the ones that finally teach us what really matters. I learned that protecting someone from consequences isn't love. It's fear disguised as love. Dante learned that respect must be earned, that trust can be rebuilt, and that the most satisfying achievements are the ones you accomplish through your own effort. Our story didn't end with that midnight discovery of theft. It began there. It began when a mother finally found the courage to let her son face reality, and when a son finally learned that real success comes from character, not comfort. The trust fund money went to people who truly understood its value. The retirement savings I lost were eventually rebuilt through my own effort and determination. The relationship between a mother and son was transformed from enablement to respect, and sometimes, late at night when I'm reviewing my carefully managed budget or reading applications for the scholarship fund, I think about that moment at midnight when I discovered my son had stolen my future. It was the worst night of my life. It was also the beginning of the best decision I ever made as a mother. Because love isn't about making someone's life easier. Love is about making someone stronger. And sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is let go.